What's going on, noobs? I am Rory, the Perpetual Noob, and welcome to my first boss video for the indie hit, Hollow Knight. This is the first video of a series where I'll be discussing each boss of Hollow Knight, where to find them, what tactics I used to defeat them, and what other tactics I believe would work, and what's their story and how does it fit into the world of Hollow Knight. So, let's get to the first boss I encountered, the False Knight. You can find the False Knight in the very center of the Forgotten Crossroads, the first area of the game you can access just after Dirtmouth. One note about the False Knight, this boss is initially skippable. You don't have to fight this boss right away if you don't want to. You will need the city crest eventually, which is dropped by the False Knight, but you can get some more charms and abilities before then, so the False Knight fight should be easier. Now, because many players will encounter this boss very early in the game, your options for defeating the False Knight are limited, unless of course you come back later. The tactic I used, and prefer to use for most bosses, was to do my best to dodge the False Knight's attacks either by jumping or walking, learn the timing windows for when the False Knight was vulnerable, wail on the boss whenever I felt safe to do so, and heal whenever I thought I could. So my plan worked out to be, jump over the shockwaves from the False Knight heavy hammer strikes, and walk around to avoid all other attacks. If you've acquired some other abilities before coming back here, I could see dashing being very helpful in dodging the False Knight's attacks, and perhaps the Vengeful Spirit ability really helping when you want to keep your distance from the False Knight. The False Knight is a great introduction to how boss fights work in Hollow Knight. The player hits the boss a few times, a successful hit is marked by the boss flashing white when struck, then the boss falls over, extra vulnerable, or perhaps actually vulnerable, and the player is able to hit them some more without worry of reprisal for a certain amount of time. Or hits. It seems to be controlled by both for all bosses. This cycle marks a phase of the boss fights in Hollow Knight. The False Knight has 3 phases, each beyond the first marked with what I like to call a temper tantrum involving the False Knights smashing the ground with their hammer on both sides of them, bringing rocks to fall on the player's head. The first phase, the False Knight has their heavy, slow hammer strike which sends a shockwave forward, their jumps, and their standard faster jumping hammer strike. The second phase shifts, so that the heavy, slow hammer strike now also causes rocks to fall on the player's head, in addition to the shockwave. The third phase shifts even more, so that every hammer strike causes rocks to fall on the player's head. Also, I'm not exactly sure, but it seems like the False Knight becomes more erratic with each phase. Maybe that's all in my head, but who knows. A special quality of the False Knight fight is that it is not officially completed, as I learned, unless you follow the False Knight down into the destroyed floor and beat them up a bit more. With all boss fights in Hollow Knight, it's not officially over until the boss explodes in a huge cloud of orange infection. So what's the story of the False Knight? From the Hunter's notes, a maggot driven mad by a strange force that inhabits a stolen armored shell. Weak creatures love to steal the strength of others. Their lives are brief and fearful, and they yearn to have the power to dominate those who have dominated them. Sounds like this False Knight was just a big jerk, so we're the hero for defeating them, right? Well, maybe not. We'll actually be revisiting the False Knight later in the series, and maybe that'll change our perspective on the False Knight. That's it for my first Hollow Knight boss discussion. Thank you for joining me today, noobs. Stay tuned for future Hollow Knight boss videos. If you've got any thoughts about the False Knight, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. I am the Perpetual Noob, and I'll see you all next time.